where would you say you differ from other people? Not just sort of referring to Huberman as an example, but where would you differ when you look at the research? How do you feel you get kind of a fairly balanced view on both sides?
Well, what I do is I'm a little bit more open-minded. In other words, in the situation that the problem is that a lot of natural substances or natural supplements might actually have utility in human physiology. But the problem is that because they're natural, there's not going to be a lot of human research on them, because human research studies are extremely expensive. And the people that can afford to pay for that, which is pharmaceutical, big pharma, they're not going to pay for it because you can't patent these natural substances. So we have a situation where a natural substance might work, but we'll never know because there's no human confirmation. Now, a lot of these substances, people will take them, especially the testosterone boosters, and the nitric oxide supplements is another example. They'll take it and say, well, I know it works because I feel I'm getting stronger, I'm getting bigger. Well, here we have what they call the placebo effect. In other words, if you believe something's going to work, about 40% of the time it will. It's not necessarily from the substance you're taking, it's your belief, because what happens is you subconsciously do things that stimulate real gains. Like if I give you a testosterone, say you're a 25-year-old guy, okay, Matthew, here, you want to get bigger, I'm giving you this testosterone supplement, testosterone booster, and you're going to get bigger. You're going to grow. You're going to grow like you took steroids. So, okay, great, Jerry. You go to the gym, and because you're taking it now, you subconsciously, you start training harder. You know you got the testosterone, so you're going to train more intensely. You're going to lift harder. You're going to maybe eat better. You're going to have more protein. That's where your gains are coming from. And you're going to wrongly attribute it to the testosterone booster, which probably did nothing. I've written about that in my applied med about Tomcat Ali.
Yeah.
But there's things you have to be aware of. There's actual human studies, and these studies were paid for by let's say companies in Malaysia. Most of your Tomcat Ali comes from Malaysia, and it's paid for, it's sponsored by the studies and by the government. So these are human studies. They're pretty good studies. They show that Tomcat Ali does raise testosterone, but there's a caveat to that. And that is the fact that you have to have lower testosterone, or in other words, if you already have normal to high levels of testosterone, Tomcat Ali will do nothing. But if you have low testosterone, like let's say a man who's over 40 starting to get lower testosterone, Tomcat Ali will actually bring up your testosterone level. Or if you're a younger man who's overtraining. Now, when you overtrain, you tend to lower your testosterone. If you don't get enough sleep, one night of not enough sleep, let's say 6 hours of sleep, 5 hours, 6 hours, you get a 15% drop in testosterone. And a young man.
For young and old, or just young?
Yeah, it makes no difference.
Wow.
And you also get a buildup of certain abnormal proteins in the brain that can set you up for Alzheimer's. That's another story. But anyway, the point being that it's conditional. In other words, Tomcat Ali works, but it's conditional.
So is Tomcat Ali something you'd recommend then if you're overtraining and not sleeping well?
Yeah, it would probably help.
And in what way would you notice that? Like just more energy?
Well, probably better gains, because testosterone is needed for muscle growth, probably better recovery, and you'd probably feel better. Yeah.
Is there any downsides to that?
No, not really. No? There's not. Normal dosages, it's very safe.
How do you find a good, because I guess there's a ton of them on the market, how do you then, so once you found that there's a particular supplement, and there's a few that I wanted to talk about here, but let's say you find a Tomcat Ali, listen to what you've said, it's like, okay, I can supplement that. Then how do you go and find the brands that are good?
That's a good question, a very good question, because it's funny that you mentioned Tomcat Ali. There's a real problem with herbal supplements, because a lot of them aren't what they call standardized. What that means is when you get a drug or a medication, because of the the Food and Drug Administration mandates that every pill, even generic drugs, have to have the same amount of active ingredient. Absolute necessity. Now herbs are not standardized, meaning that one pill can have more than the other, and there's a problem. And then, because Tomcat Ali tends to be a little bit on the expensive side, the genuine Tomcat Ali, you have a lot of knockoff fakes. So you don't even know if you're taking. That's a real problem. So the only thing I would recommend is to, if you're contemplating using Tongkat Ali, contact the company, ask them for a lab analysis to prove that it's genuine Tongkat Ali, because you could be buying, who knows what's in there. It could be parsley or something. It might not be anything. So that's a real problem with herbal supplements, is a lack of standardization. That's the biggest problem.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about as it relates to supplementation is creatine.
Yeah.
I was interested in the history, and then is it good or bad, and your views on that, really.
I think if you were to ask me to name the single most effective sports supplement in the world, I would unhesitatingly say creatine. It's effective for 80% of people who use it. Now you're wondering, well, who are the other 20%? Well, creatine is found naturally in certain protein foods like meat and fish. If you are one of those people that habitually eats a lot of, let's say, red meat, let's say 3 or 4 times a week, you're getting creatine all the time. So you're kind of in a natural creatine load state. So if you take a supplemental creatine, you'll still get benefit, but not as much benefit as a person who doesn't eat as much meat. So again, it's the single most effective supplement. Creatine
For what? Just so I can...
it increases a number of things. It increases workout intensity. The basic function of creatine is you have a substance called the most elemental source of energy is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Now the way it works is ATP, and the process of producing energy, one of the phosphate, it has 3 phosphates attached to it, adenosine, right? Just imagine 3 phosphates attached to adenosine. One of the phosphates breaks off, that's energy, right? Now you have what they call adenosine diphosphate, and then it can become adenosine monophosphate. Now where creatine steps in, creatine can be, I compare it to like having an extra battery in your car. If your battery runs dead, the second battery takes over. What creatine does, it's stored in the muscle as creatine phosphate. So when the ATP is let's say, degraded in the course of producing energy, the stored creatine muscle will donate the phosphate and actually, renew or replenish the ATP. Now, this process takes about 2 to 3 minutes. Now, this relates to working out, because if you want maximum strength gains, you want to rest between sets 2 to 3 minutes. Why? Because it takes 2 to 3 minutes to fully replenish the ATP. If you don't rest that long, you're not going to get the full replenishment, and you're not going to have the strength and power. So that's 2
to 3 minutes.
2 to 3 minutes
in between sets.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that point in a minute, but carry on.
Go ahead. Anyway, creatine, a lot of people think it's new. You asked about the history.
Yeah.
Creatine was actually discovered by a French researcher back in 1834. Yeah, they discovered in 1834, but nobody really knew what it did. They really didn't have any idea. Then it was researched in the early 20th century. An interesting kind of side note to creatine is that around 1925, they published a study. They looked at a stuff called creatine ethyl ester, which is a form of creatine that was not, only a couple of years ago, was released on the commercial market as being 400% better than normal creatine, right? Creatine ethyl ester is kind of attached to an alcohol moiety, so supposedly it's absorbed better. But this 1925 study showed that creatine ethyl ester has no creatine effect whatsoever. But when the people re-released it as a creatine supplement, they left that part out. But then, unfortunately, a couple of other researchers, probably people who sell other types of creatine, analyzed the effects of creatine ethyl ester. Sure enough, they found after 30 minutes following oral ingestion, it's degraded into creatinine. Creatinine is the major waste product of creatine. A lot of people might have heard of creatinine because when you take lab tests, one of the kidney tests is for creatinine. Because the body maintains a certain ratio of creatinine, and if the ratio gets too high, it's an indication of possible kidney damage or impending kidney failure. Now, there's a problem with that, because if you do what they call a creatine load, which involves taking let's say 30 grams of creatine 5 to 6 days a week, and then you go to have a lab test, you will show an elevated creatinine, and the doctor will want you to take a kidney biopsy to make sure that you don't have damaged kidney, but you don't need it. It's from the creatine, see? So it's been around, but...
I remember it in the sort of late 80s. That's when I first sort of remember people in the gyms using it.
Actually, yeah, that's true, because what happened was in the 70s, East German and Russian athletes, they were the first. They were giving their athletes vials of creatine phosphate during competition. They were giving them vials of creatine phosphate. That was the first athletic use, but they kind of kept it to themselves. They didn't want the Western athletes to know about it, so they kind of kept it, you know. They were also using androstenedione, which is later on became a pro hormone, but they weren't giving it was an early testosterone booster. But they weren't giving androstenedione to the athletes to boost testosterone. They were doing it because androstenedione increases aggression, and they wanted their athletes to be aggressive for competition. But anyway, it turns out that in the early 80s, a couple of companies started producing creatine. That's probably when you first heard of it. A friend of mine, Bob Fritz, was one of the first guys. I can't remember what company he was working for. He came out with the very first commercial creatine supplement around 1985, but it didn't catch on. For some reason, it didn't catch on. I don't know why.
I remember people. I remember it from the gym, and I remember people sort of mentioning that you used to, you would sort of do it for a period and then stop, but you held a lot of water. I remember people saying, and then so you didn't really gain anything. You just sort of blew up with water, and then when you stopped it, you went down. I was curious to know, like, in terms of muscle size, are you getting gains through the extra energy along with some sort of water retention, or is it just all, you know, what's going on there?
There is water retention, but it's intracellular, and that's good.
What does that mean?
And though the water is held within the cells rather than external under the skin.
Okay.
It doesn't give you a bloated look, in other words, but it does retain water, especially when you do what they call the creatine load, which, as I said, involves taking about 25 to 30 grams of creatine 5 to 6 days, and then going to a maintenance dosage of about maybe 5 grams after that. That will definitely retain some water, but you know, it's not just water, because creatine stimulates processes in muscle that build real muscle. For example, creatine stimulates a hormone called insulin-like growth factor 1. When it's produced intramuscular, there's different forms of IGF-1. Some of it's produced in the liver through the release of growth hormone. Growth hormone, when it gets to the liver, it will stimulate the production of IGF-1. That's called systemic IGF-1. That maintains your heart, your neurons in the brain, and your connective tissue, right? Now, there's a separate IGF-1, which is produced directly in muscle. It's produced when muscles damage. What it does is it stimulates the activation of what they call satellite cells. Satellite cells are muscle stem cells heavily involved in the repair and building of muscle. So when you take creatine, it actually stimulates intramuscular IGF-1, which in turn stimulates satellite cells. That's real muscle. That's an anabolic effect, a direct. And secondarily, that water retention effect that we mentioned, the intracellular, you see, you don't want, like a bodybuilder, he doesn't want extracellular water because it'll smooth him out. It obscures muscular definition. That's why they take diuretic drugs, to get rid of that last bit of water. Makes them look super cut. Looks like they have see-through skin, translucent. But so you want to keep the water inside, like stored in muscle, like each gram of glycogen stored with 2.7 grams of muscle. That's why they do carbo loading, to get more glycogen and more water in the muscle, which gives you a fuller looking muscle. Now, but there's a secondary reason why you want intracellular water, because it has what they call a cellular swelling effect. In other words, when the cell is hydrated, it actually, I know this sounds weird, it actually promotes anabolic signals. It stimulates what they call myogenic factors that also help build muscle. So creatine works in that way too. So creatine is truly not only an energy-producing supplement because of its effect on ATP, but it also has a direct anabolic effect in muscle. That's why I consider it the #1, because it works. It simply works for almost everybody who uses it.
What do you do to find a good, without sort of promoting any brand names? Again, how do you look for a good creatine? Because my guess is there's a lot of them out there, good and bad.
Well, generally speaking, there was a real problem with a lot of the creatine that was used in commercial supplements emanated from China. Now, the problem with that, you probably already know what I'm about to say. China is famous for their poor quality control. Most of your amino acids come from China.
Really?
I'm not saying they're bad, but I'm saying they don't use I'll give you a quick example to really make this clear. A couple of years ago, back in I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, did you ever have an amino acid called tryptophan?
I've heard of it.
Okay, tryptophan is an essential amino acid. A lot of people take it because it's a precursor for a brain neurotransmitter called serotonin, which is involved in sleep. So they take they take tryptophan because it's rapidly converted in the brain into serotonin, helps you relax, helps you get to sleep, right? Okay, it turns out that most of your, as I said earlier, most of your amino acids were coming from China. Well, the Chinese decided to use a new process involving, see, the way they produce amino acids is through bacterial fermentation process. They decided to use a new filtering system to produce tryptophan, which would lower the cost of producing it. Unfortunately, this new filtering system turned out to be inefficient, and it left some contaminants in the tryptophan, and they didn't know this was happening. It was released onto the market. They later identified the contaminant was called peak E, and it caused a disease called eosinophilia myalgia, where a lot of people, about 300 people, got very sick because of the tryptophan, causing the government to pull all tryptophan supplements off the market. Strangely, it was left in baby food. They would still allow tryptophan. Can you figure that out? You would think babies are the most, susceptible, but they said the babies can still have tryptophan, but everybody else can't have it. Anyway, once they identified, they straightened it out, and tryptophan today is very safe. There's no problem. My point is, though, that I tell you that anecdote to illustrate the problem with China is that in regard to creatine. Their creatine also has been found to have impurities. Because of bad processing, the type of impurities is a little bit shocking. I'm sure a lot of people are startled. They're forms of cyanide, which of course is a poison. Now, let me quickly add, I'm not saying if you take Chinese creatine, it's going to kill you. But what you will feel is a lot of people who've taken creatine, they say they get nauseous. They don't feel good. That's your sign that you're using a cheap, crappy grade of creatine. The best creatine, actually, again, I'll name a generic name. It's called Creapure. Creapure. It's from a company in Germany. That is the purest creatine in the world. There's a couple other companies in the United States that also make very good grades of creatine. But, there's no reason why a person taking a creatine supplement should have bloating or gastrointestinal issues. If you're having them, there's something wrong with your creatine. Creatine does not do that unless it's a poor quality. That's your tip-off.
And recommended dosage, obviously depends on the quality in that, but is it something that you take all the time? I know in my pre-workout, which I'm going to come on to in a minute, it's got creatine in. So do you have to sort of phase on and off because it might do some harm, or what are your recommendations?
Another good question, because creatine uptake is determined by something called the creatine transport protein within muscle. When creatine was first introduced in the 90s, that's when it first became popular. They were advised, you were advised to take creatine with a large amount of rapidly absorbed carbohydrate. They were recommending as much as 95 grams of carbohydrate for each teaspoon or 5 grams of creatine. Now, that's a lot of carbohydrate. Now, you say to me, why carbohydrate? Because carbohydrate stimulates insulin, especially a rapidly absorbed form of carbohydrate. Insulin, in turn, stimulates it gets a little complicated. It stimulates what's called the potassium-sodium pump in cells. This, in turn, it's one thing following another. That in turn turns on what they call the creatine transport protein, and that pushes the creatine into the muscle. So they later on though they found that it's not even insulin that you need. It's actually, if you really want to turn it on, sodium, because sodium actually turns on the sodium pump. It makes sense, doesn't it? But you don't have to take salt with your. The normal amount of salt in the diet's plenty. You don't have to have added salt. And they discovered that just taking creatine with a quick-acting protein like whey, because whey, some of the amino acids in whey are absorbed fast enough to stimulate a substantial release of insulin, and that also will push you don't need to take any carbohydrates. Now, one issue that came out related to what you were saying, when creatine first came on the market, they realized how creatine is absorbed through this creatine transport protein, and the theory was that if you used creatine on a continuous basis without, let's say, cycling it or getting off, you would tone down the creatine transport protein. This has to do, like for example, when you take testosterone, your androgen receptors, this happens with a lot of receptors in the body. If you take something continuously, your body senses it and it downgrades the receptors. It's kind of a protective device of the body, doesn't want you to get messed up. So they thought that by taking creatine continuously, it would turn off the creatine transport protein and your creatine would all go to waste. Now they know that's not true. A couple of years later, they realized you can take creatine all the time. You don't have to cycle. If you want, you could cycle it. Now, there is one, again, caveat to that. One of the controversies about creatine is that, remember I mentioned that the major byproduct of creatine metabolism is called creatinine. Now, creatinine, again, is excreted by the kidneys. There's a certain segment of the medical population, let's call it, that believes that excess creatinine is harmful for the kidneys, and they claim that using creatine all the time eventually will cause kidney damage. But there's no real evidence of that. However, if you have some sort of pre-existing, this is an important point, not normal kidneys, if you, let's say, take lab tests and you show a little bit off-kilter kidney, this is a little more common when you get past 40, it probably would be a good idea to cycle the creatine just as an insurance measure. You probably don't need to, but just on the safe side, it'd probably be a good idea to take creatine. If you get off creatine Creatine stays stored in your muscles for 30 days once it's loaded. So you'd have to get off creatine at least 2 months for it return to baseline levels. Then you could go back on again.
How would that, because you mentioned it's in meat and fish, so if you eat that regularly, I guess are you maintaining a baseline and you'd have to almost like stop eating that as well, would you? Or
No, you could still eat. I'm talking about, you see, they have to understand the creatine supplements are much more concentrated.
Okay.
1 teaspoon of creatine, which is 5 grams, that equals the amount of creatine found in 4 pounds of meat.
Right.
So you'd have to eat a lot of fish. Now, if you're eating, let's say, sardines, which, if I remember correctly, I forget whether it's sardines or anchovies, one of the two, is the #1 actual food source of creatine. It's not red meat, it's the fish. One of those is the richest source of creatine. If you were to eat 5 or 6, maybe 7 pounds a day of that fish, then you'd have a problem because you'd still that's like you're still taking a lot of creatine. To my knowledge, most people don't like fish that much, unless you're an Eskimo somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, and with that, would it be fair to say then that if you did have a pretty good diet, that your body does need it, you use it, but you want to be sort of fairly careful in terms of how much over and above you take outside of good food?
Oh, you mean the creatine supplement itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, because remember, your body, for example, makes 1 gram of creatine a day. It's made from the 3 amino acids: methionine, glycine, and arginine. Those are the precursors for creatine. It's made in the liver, kidney, and pancreas. So even if you take no creatine, your body will still produce 1 gram of creatine. Because like I say, it's essential to health. It really is. Even though it's not considered an essential nutrient, it really is important. But the point being that the average person, if they eat some of the creatine foods like meat and fish, will get another gram. So they're taking an average of, let's say, producing in their body 1 gram in the body, 1 gram outside, 2 grams a day, right? Now, It turns out that's what the body is basically used to. So if you take 5 grams, which is a teaspoon, you're already taking kind of a mega dose of creatine, right? Now, if you start, now they have, like I said earlier, they have what they call a creatine load. That was the first way creatine was suggested to be taken when it first came out. Again, you take 5 grams, which is a teaspoon, about 5 to 6 times a day for 5 to 6 days. Then you go back to maybe about a teaspoon after that. And the idea was that you load your muscles with creatine. Subsequent research over the years showed that after 48 hours, but you have to understand 30, let's say 25 to 30 grams a day, which is what you'll be taking in the load, that's a massive amount. That's like 25 to 30 times more than your body ever makes. Your body's not used to that. So what they found is after 48 hours on a creatine load, more than 50% of the creatine is being excreted right out. It's wasted. So in other words, the best way to take creatine, based on my research, is to take no more than 5 grams. If you take 5 grams, 1 teaspoon, in 30 days, you'll have the same amount of creatine loaded in your muscle as if you did a 1-week load. And you will not be wasting any of the creatine, and you will not get the water retention that comes, because with the load, you do get water retention. You know, like I say, even though most of it's internal, if you're, let's say, a track athlete or somebody that's dependent on not having a lot of extra weight, it could be detrimental. So if you take the 1 teaspoon a day for 30 days, there's no problem with the bloating or the water retention.